This is Debbie from the Sterling Heights Library. I'm here today to talk about some genealogy research tips using immigration passenger lists. Virtually all of our ancestors in the United States came from somewhere else. A lot of people are really interested in where their families came from, and I've talked to lots of people who start talking about genealogy, but really the one thing that they want to know is when their family came and what ship they came on and what it looked like. They want to see their name in a list. It's an emotional thing that people like to acquire and display sometimes. So even if you're not interested in doing all the rest of your family tree, you can still find your relative's name on a passenger list usually. Usually it was the first tangible evidence of your family being in the United States, their existence here. So they usually, just have to kind of picture what they were thinking when they decided to leave their home country, that they had to get on a ship, usually, because most of the families came over long enough ago that there weren't planes to get on. So they got on a ship. Ships have to be in a port city. If your town is in the middle of a country, a landlocked area, you have to go through some things before you can be on your way. So they would go to a port city on the ocean. A port city would be a city that had deep enough water that the bigger ships could go on, not just any old town along the water. So they would go to a port city, they get on a ship with all their belongings that they could manage to bring, and then they came across the ocean. And so depending on where they were headed, or depending on lots of things really, there's different ports that they may have come through. And then to find out where they came, there were different documents at different times in history that gave different information too. So if they came like prior to 1820, before 1820, there wasn't a great system for keeping track of who came. The states or colonies, if it was farther back, kept track of some things. So those lists, which weren't required to be done, but a lot of them did it, they're not consolidated easily into a nice, easy to search database. Some of them are just in archives that you can find. So that's just prior to 1820. Then in 1819, there was something called the Steerage Act, which required captains to submit a list of all their passengers to the customs collector when they got to the town they were going to, the port of entry. And on those documents, they had the name of the ship, the port of embarkation, which is where they left from. They embarked on this trip, and the date and port of arrival, when they got to America, and then the passenger's name, age, gender, occupation, and nationality. So all those things are kind of cool to find out about your ancestor. And all of these facts, when you start collecting them, are jumping off points for further genealogy research. So in 1891, the U.S. Immigration Service was founded, and they began to control the collection of these records. And they added some additional information to the form and standardized the forms. So they added information about marital status, the last town of residence, which is really valuable information, their final destination, where they were headed to, a name of a person at that place. That's usually a relative or a friend that they were heading toward. whether they could read or write, how much money they had on them, which is kind of an interesting, thing. They were supposed to have a minimum of so much, which is very little in our money now, but it'll have a note as to how much money they had on them when they came, which is sort of an interesting thing, especially when you compare it to other people on the passenger list. It has the race, the place of birth, the personal description, like how tall they were, what color their hair was, what color their eyes were, things like that. Name and address of a nearest friend or relative in the old country, which that's an interesting little tidbit too, because often, it can be a relative and it's a link to somebody back there that you can continue your research on. So those forms started in 1893. Now, a lot of people think that, when their relatives came, everybody went through Ellis Island. That Ellis Island is the name that everybody knows. Ellis Island was a place that many, thousands and thousands of people did go through. It was an island in the port of New York that the ship stopped at on the way, and they were processed there. But prior to the use of or creation of Ellis Island, there was another place called Castle Garden. And in 1855, between 1855 and 1890, Castle Garden was used as the place that immigrants came through. So if your family came through between those years, which a lot of them did, they did not actually go to Ellis Island. They went to an island called Castle Garden. It may have been the same place, but different building. I'm not sure, but they went to a place called Castle Garden, Castlegarden. So in 1890, Castle Garden closed, and then in 1892, Ellis Island opened, and they were the ones that processed immigrants up until 1924. Each of those places now has a website where you can search the people who have gone through there, and usually, often you can link to the passenger list image, or if not the image, they'll tell you the information that was on it and where you can go to request the actual image. So there were other places too that that ships came to in the United States. Practically any big port along the ocean was a candidate. Galveston, Texas was a place. So if your family is from down south, maybe western down, in Texas area, they may have come in through there. San Francisco, California, a lot of immigrants that came from across the Pacific Ocean came in through San Francisco. Boston, New Orleans, Philadelphia, Baltimore, those were all popular cities that immigrants came through as well. They would come from their ship from Europe or wherever, and that's the first place in America that they hit. So they may not have used Ellis Island. So if you're looking for your ancestor in Ellis Island records, they may not be there because they're actually in a Baltimore list or something. Canada is another popular place, especially for people in Michigan, and people whose families have been around here for a long time in Detroit. The jump from Canada to Detroit was not big, as we know, and there weren't as many rules about crossing that border back when. Halifax, Nova Scotia was a very popular port town in Canada that people came through. There's lots of different reasons that people would have come, and different ways that they may have come through. Different laws might have been different. They may have left their home country because of wars, because of economic issues, because of famines, because Heredity laws changed, and inheritance, where they couldn't inherit anything, the farm or whatever, from their family because of where they placed in the family, religious reasons, all kinds of things that cause people to come here. Many countries had military requirements for young men, that they had to join the armies at a certain age, and maybe their families could see that things were going to get dangerous, and they didn't want their sons to be in that, so they would leave. They would come to the United States or other countries too. So the National Archives holds all the originals of most of these immigration lists, but nowadays most everything has been scanned and you can find it online somehow. There are some things that were missing, destroyed, like the Galveston, Texas records I read were destroyed in a hurricane, years ago, most of the records. So there was that. And then there was also land border crossings where people maybe were in Canada or in Mexico, came, over land to get into America. They started keeping track of those, the Canadian ones in 1895. Prior to that, nobody noted who came across. In Mexico, they started in 1906. That's the main places that they came through. There's different databases that you can search for your people in. Family Search, which is a free database that you can access from home. They have all this stuff. Ancestry, if you have access to a subscription version, you can get it through there too. The library, our library, Sterling Heights Library, subscribes to Ancestry, and you can use it in the library and come in and use it. And then for a short time coming up in the future here, you can access it a special way from home. Let's see. And like I said about the actual websites for Castle Garden and for Ellis Island, you can search there too. You can actually order fancy prints of the immigration passenger list with your family on it if you wanted to display it in your home or something. You do that through the website. Then there's another website called stevemorse.org, stevemorse.org, that he has all kinds of helps in doing genealogy. And one of them is a thing that kind of pulls together a lot of the sites that have passenger lists, and you can kind of search them there rather than having to jump around through all different sources. It may not have the image, but at least it gets you somewhere that you know where to look. These are the web addresses. You can see them. So there's Ancestry, or you can use the library one. Family Search. This is Ellis Island. It's called libertyellisfoundation.org. It's Castle Garden, and then stevemorse.org. Okay. All right. So I'm going to do a demonstration of what you can see on a form, and I will do that in a moment. Okay, first I'm going to show what the Ellis Island website. This is the homepage for that. You put in your search. They do have you create an account with the database. It's free, but you have to create a little account before you can do a search. but they have, or before you can see anything, you can do the search. But one person I was going to try. Well, let's do this first. This is what the Steve Morse website looks like. This is stevemorse.org. And over on the side over here, he has all different kinds of genealogy related things. And the very top one is Ellis Island and Castle Garden. And then there's breakdowns of things you can search there. So that's a really interesting thing to play around with for all kinds of things, all kinds of genealogy information he has help with there. So something, I was going to show an example of somebody, and I thought it'd be fun to do it maybe with a celebrity. So I thought of who may have been born in another country during this time frame and came to America. Well, I thought of Cary Grant. Cary Grant looks like this over here. Most people are probably familiar with him as a movie star from the old days of Hollywood. He was born in 1904 in England, and his real name is not Cary Grant. He was born Archibald Leitch, Leach, in 1904 in England. So he came to the United States, and according to biographical things I found, his first trip to the United States was in 1920. So you should be able to find that documentation of that trip. And then every other trip after, wealthy people like him would have traveled many times across back and forth to Europe or wherever. And I found quite a list of his travels, but this was his earliest one. In 1920, he was 16 years old. According to the biography, he was working for a vaudeville company, a troupe, and they made a trip to the United States, and they were going to tour in the United States. So I looked in Family Search, and I found him. When you search, this is in Family Search, when you search his name, you get lots of records of all kinds of things, but when you sort through them all and find the one that you're looking for, this was the 1920 trip, event 1920, and it gives you a little summary thing, and then it gives you a picture of the actual passenger list image, which you can go into and look at, but you need to sign in. That's another one, you have to have an account. It's free though, but you do have to do that. So that's how it would look on Family Search. Ancestry, I did the same thing. This is Family Search. Ancestry, I like using the best for this sort of thing, just in the way that they allow you to look at the images. So this is a thing that came up for him when I searched, and I found that 1920 trip that he made. You can zoom in on these over here. There's the enlarge button, and you really would need to enlarge it a lot to make out anything from these things. But okay, so the top of this page here says list or manifest of alien passengers for the United, cut off. Has the name of the ship. This is SS Olympic, passengers sailing from Southampton, that's in England, July 21st, 1920. So they, in this particular list, let's see, where did I see that? Anyway, they list all the people. They're all numbered down the side here. And they've got names in full, so their last names are down here. First names are in this column. And there's all kinds of things written in and stamped, and because they created these lists when they left their home port. And then they made their trip across the ocean, got to New York or wherever. Then they looked over these lists. So the lists were not created at Ellis Island, so nobody was making mistakes with names at Ellis Island. But sometimes mistakes were made elsewhere where a name isn't what you expect it to be, or it's phonetically spelled or whatever. But anyway, so they've got their name, their age at the time, if they were married or single, have S's and M's and a WD for widowed. You may find a D for divorced occasionally too. Their calling or occupation, that can be very interesting. I mean, just browsing down through here, I see valet, something kind of machine, minder, or I don't know, miller, dressmaker, wife, housekeeper, artist. So has that information. There has whether they were able to read or write, has their nationality, has their race, it says race or people. So in this case, most of them are saying they're English, even though I don't know if that's not really a race or people, but that's what they considered it at the time, because this ship was leaving from England, so it's likely that most of these people would be British. Last permanent residence, that's very important information, has the country and city or town. So it may not have been where they were born, but they have some connection to that town. And if you're trying to find out information about their life prior to this trip, that might be the first starting point where you would look. Here they have the name and complete address of nearest relative or friend and country whence alien came. So that would be a person from their home town, most likely. They list the relationship, mother, sister, it'll say in-law, sometimes wife, whatever, friend. So it gives a name and an actual address in a town, and that's more information that you can use, and it just fleshes out their life for you too. It gives the final destination, like where they were headed to, why they were coming here. A lot of these are New York, but there's Massachusetts, New Jersey, Michigan, Ecorse, Michigan, Illinois. So that's interesting. I mean, it was what their intention was at the time. It maybe wasn't where they ended up. But when they first went on their trip, that's where they thought they were going. So that's the first page. And on this list, how we were going to look for Archibald Leitch, if we scroll down here it is here. Leitch, Archibald Alec, 16 years old, male, single, etc. He's listed as an artist, which most performers seem to have been listed as that. Not like a painting kind of artist, but performing artist. He's from Great Britain, English. Here it lists this person named C. Leitch, who's the relative that he's listing as a contact, and the address for that, and that he was headed for New York. So all this is interesting, and he was traveling alone because he was traveling as part of this performing troupe. It wasn't like a typical family coming over together. Sometimes you'll see, a family name, and then the mother and father and the children are all underneath there. Also, a lot of times when families came over, the man would come first and get set up, get a job, maybe a home, just get settled in the country. And then his wife and family, children, etc., would come maybe a year or two later, or months later, however long it took them to be prepared. So when you're looking through general lists of these names, there's usually lists of a woman with a bunch of children, and then the men are on other ships. So that's that page. Now, many people think that when they see these pages, that that's all there is to it. That, I mean, you get a lot of information. It seems complete. They print this out and go on their way. But these more contemporary sheets like this have 2 pages of information. And you have to go usually to the little next page symbol there and go to the second page, and you notice that it completes that heading at the top where it chopped off at United on the other page. So it says, United States Immigration Officer at Port of Arrival, arriving at, where the other page was the leaving information, arriving at Port of New York, July 28th, 1920, which was about a week after they set sail. So they do not have the names again on the second page. So you have to note what line number that person or group that you were on was on. So Archibald Leitch was number 19 on that other page. So here he is here, this row here. And the column headings up here, it has like who paid the passage cost. Often it's a self or a parent or an employer, and that's listed there. This is how much money they had on their person when they came. They were supposed to have a minimum of something. I don't know what it is, $50 or something there, but it lists how much everybody had, which is interesting. Here they're asking if they've ever been in the United States before or not. And that's interesting too, because if you find one of these records and you're not sure if it was the first time they came or not, because many people did go back and forth. I mean, like in Cary Grant's case, it was because, he probably had work in other countries when he was making movies, he vacationed, those sorts of things. Regular people might do that because they had to go back to see their family, maybe a relative died. They were visiting, they went to bring a wife back with them, all different reasons. But there's multiple trips for people, so you have to kind of watch for that. So this will kind of help you when it says how many times they've been before. This column is whether they're going to join a relative or friend, and his name and address. So that's interesting. In Archibald Leitch's case, they put down he was going to something called the Globe Theater on Broadway in New York, because the whole group was going to perform a vaudeville act. And it asks how long they plan on staying. Then all these questions about, are you an anarchist? Are you a bigamist? All these sorts of things where they were trying to weed out people. Of course, no one ever admits to anything bad. Condition of health, mental and physical. Everybody here says they're good. Whether they're deformed or crippled. Height, complexion, color of hair, eyes. And those are all interesting things just from a personal angle, to know your ancestor or anybody that you're looking up. Marks of identification. This one fellow had operation marks on his left leg. Mark over right eye. These all have nothing. But that's kind of an interesting little thing. Place of birth is real important, country and city, because that gives you a place to research their birth and their original family if you're going to pursue that. And again, all these things are as they were answered at the time. So if they misunderstood something, it's possible to have wrong answers on these things. But, and then there's these crossouts, I think, mean the person did not end up coming after all. Like maybe they got off the ship before it left, or something happened where even though their name is on this list, they maybe didn't actually come. Then there's other things about their situation. They went back to these forms years later sometimes and edited them to add information about them. Like Cary Grant's had some writing here about some other trips and some numbers and things, probably because he made so many trips. Here's something with a 1933 date. So this is a wonderful and fun resource to find out information about your family or anybody else that you feel like looking up. Once they were here and established, they often became citizens, and there's a whole process of documents that you can find relating to that gives information about their hometown in their home country and that kind of thing too. But that's a whole nother story. So here's Archie Leitch's passenger list for the first time he came to America. So that's the end of my presentation today.